Consider the founding of this country. And this is such an important thing. When everything that we're doing, the old cliche of we're standing on the shoulders of giants is so true. You know, a dozen of the 56 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence were politicians, doctors, or ministers. 11 of them were merchants. 9 were farmers. Ben Franklin was kind of hard to define. He was a printer. He was a musician. He was a Renaissance man. There was also a teacher who signed the Declaration of Independence. There was a professional musician who signed the Declaration of Independence. The oldest was Franklin. He was in his 80s. The youngest was in their 20s. Thomas Jefferson, at 33, was about the average age of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence. These were the idealists of their day. These were the liberal children of the Enlightenment. While the conservatives of their day argued that America should remain a colony of England forever, these liberal radicals believed in both individual liberty and societal obligations. What a radical notion. A nation must care for the lives of its own, guarantee liberty, and ensure its citizens' happiness. This is a word that had never before appeared in the founding document of any nation. Totally radical concept. The signers wrote in the Declaration, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And it was a simple statement of fact. The day they signed that document, each one of them legally became a traitor and was sentenced to death for treason by the legal government that controlled their lands and their homes. As Ben Franklin pointed out, they stood at the point of no return and, quote, "Indeed, we must all hang together, otherwise we shall most assuredly hang separately." When Rhode Island's Stephen Hopkins signed the Declaration of Independence, he remarked to his friend William Ellery, quote, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." But Virginia's Benjamin Harrison, who weighed nearly 300 pounds, turned to Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, a short, thin man, and said, "With me, the hanging will be over in a minute, but you're going to be dancing in the air for an hour after I'm gone." Little gallows humor there. John Hancock, the wealthiest among them, and by today's standards would just be considered the upper middle class, signed his name large enough that the king, to quote Hancock, "can read my name without glasses and can now double the reward," end quote, of 500 pounds that had already been put on his head for sedition. Just 6 months after he signed this document, the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock would lose his newborn daughter to complications of childbirth arising from his wife's fleeing the oncoming British Army. Although wealthy by the standards of today, he would hardly qualify as rich by today's standards. He founded no dynasty, no foundations today dispense his money. His legacy, our nation. Another of the wealthiest of the signers was Thomas Nelson of Virginia, but a year after signing the Declaration, the British had seized his home and lands. When George Washington attacked the British in Nelson's hometown, Nelson encouraged George Washington to attack Nelson's own home, where General Cornwallis, the British general, had taken his headquarters. The house was damaged, and after the war, Nelson, unable to repay the loans he'd taken out against his home to help finance the revolution, lost much of his property and died in debt at the age of 50. Robert Morris, a Philadelphia merchant, lost all his ships. He was totally wiped out. William Ellery of Rhode Island signed the Declaration of Independence. He lost everything, as did Virginia's Benjamin Harrison, Pennsylvania's George Clymer, New York's Philip Livingston, Georgia's Lyman Hall, and New Jersey's Francis Hopkinson. The British destroyed New York's Francis Lewis's property and threw his wife into such a hellhole of a jail that she died 2 years later. 3 of South Carolina's 4 signers, Edward Rutledge, Thomas Hayward Jr., and Arthur Middleton, were captured by the British and held in a filthy, unheated prison and brutally tortured for over a year before George Washington, who, by the way, banned torture, freed them in a prisoner exchange. New Jersey farmer John Hart's wife died shortly before he signed the Declaration of Independence. Here is a single father with 13 children. After he signed it, he had to go into hiding. His 13 children were scattered among sympathetic families to hide them from the British and from the conservative loyalists. He never saw them again, dying alone and racked with grief 3 years later. Altogether, 17 of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence were wiped out and died as paupers because of the war they declared. New Jersey State Supreme Court Justice Richard Stockton took his wife and children into hiding after he signed the Declaration, but conservatives loyal to the Crown turned them in. He was so badly beaten and starved in the British prison that he died before the war was over. His home was looted. His wife and children lived the rest of their lives as paupers. Altogether, 9 of the men in that room died, and 4 lost their children as a direct result of putting their names to the Declaration of Independence. Every single one of those 56 people had to flee their homes, and after the war, 12 returned to find only rubble. After the war was over and the conservatives had fled to Canada and England, the survivors of the new American nation met to put into final form the legal structure of the nation they'd just birthed. They said it wasn't going to be a nation of cynical, selfish libertarians who believed the highest value was individual freedom and independence from society, or that the greatest motivator was, as Ronald Reagan liked to point out, greed. No. And it wasn't to be a kingdom ruled by a warlord elite. That wasn't on the plan either, and you won't find that in the Constitution. It was not to be a theocracy. In fact, the Constitution explicitly said there shall be no religious test for public office. And it was not to be a feudal nation ruled by the rich. In fact, what kicked off the Revolutionary War in 1773 was a revolt against the largest corporation in the world, the British East India Company, in Boston Harbor, now known as the Boston Tea Party, as the result of a tax cut, not a tax increase. The Tea Act of 1773. It was a tax cut for the British East India Company, and the colonists said no. What kind of nation was birthed? As Benjamin Franklin told Philadelphia's Mrs. Powell after she asked what happened at the Constitutional Convention, what sort of nation is this going to be? He said, "It will be a republic, ma'am."